Hi, I'm Erica, a WestfordCAT intern. Here I have Dr. Jenna Vinson. She is a UMass Lowell English professor with specialties in rhetoric and gender studies. Hi.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. So to start off, you do have a book published that is called Embodying the Problem, the Persuasive Power of the Teen Mother. So how long have you been studying this stigmatization of teen motherhood?
I've been studying this for over a decade. So this was a topic I took up in graduate school as something I was interested in based partially in my own experience as a quote-unquote teen mother. I had my first child at 17, and just in observing the kind of everyday reactions of the public around me while I was visibly pregnant and then parenting Mary Jane, I was puzzled by the hostility and the kind of interactions I had, kind of insulted at times, upset at times, but I just lived my life. And then in graduate school, and actually beginning in undergrad, learning about feminist movements and the kinds of initiatives to make sure that women were not unduly judged for their sexual and reproductive decisions, learning about the fact that women were often throughout history labeled sluts or whores or bad for multiple sexual and reproductive decisions. I kind of saw my own experience of young motherhood, wrong motherhood, as part of that historical tradition, that kind of icky historical tradition. So in graduate school, when we were thinking of things we could research for better understanding how rhetoric works and how rhetoric contributes to systems of oppression or resistance, I thought for sure, why not research young motherhood and how it's developed as a site for pathologization, meaning that we see it as a social problem, and kind of research also the efforts to resist that stigmatization. So that's where the book came from. So it's been about a decade.
Wow, that's awesome. So one common stereotype that women who have abortions, people that have abortions, or and/or are teen mothers, is irresponsibility. Yes. So how can we cancel that type of stereotype, and how can we also cancel other types of stigmatization?
Yeah. I wish I could magically wave a wand and get rid of all stigmatization of those kinds of sexual and reproductive decisions, but I think this idea of irresponsibility is key to pushing that stigma forward, the idea that it is uniquely a woman's responsibility to control pretty much everything in her sexual and reproductive life. And by control, typically what is meant is prevent, that you're under the surface of all this discourse of an irresponsible woman getting an abortion or an irresponsible woman making the decision to continue a pregnancy and raise a child, is the idea that women are uniquely responsible for controlling what happens to their bodies, and should, for some reason, adhere to kind of an idealized life script, that you abstain from sex to a certain point, and there's always the idea that it is education, higher education, marriage, home ownership, and so there's this kind of implied series of steps, and you can call it tradition, but home ownership and kinds of purchasing and education, there's a kind of economics undergirding this as well. So this is a constructed vision of an ideal, and so when women experience things that stray from that, they're labeled as irresponsible. How to cancel that? I believe strongly in the kind of transformational potential of reproductive justice. And reproductive justice is a framework developed by women of color in the 1990s, specifically a collective called Sister Song, led by Loretta Ross, or I don't know if she would like me to say led, but to bring attention to all that we don't talk about when we talk about reproductive rights. That is often focused narrowly on abortion and kind of at times birth control, but really focused on women's right to abortion, and overlooks a lot of what women of color have struggled with, and that includes things like forced sterilization, difficulty accessing any kind of health care, let alone an abortion procedure, because of economic disparities and racism that affects your ability to get a job, live in healthy environments, right? We've talked about this, you and I, in the past, about women of color or people of color more likely living in areas that have pollutants or issues within the environment caused by industrialization and other kinds of things. That affects one's ability to have a viable pregnancy and reproduce or raise children in a healthy environment. None of that really gets discussed. We typically focus on abortion and the right to have one or not. And so reproductive justice brings attention to the environments that surround women's bodies as they make decisions about sex and pregnancy and raising children, and kind of puts the onus on the systems and environment that surround the woman, and kind of draws attention away from just her, right? So if we really want people to have pregnancies only when they want them, right? What in our environment or system would we need to do to ensure that everybody has the right to knowledge about their body and the right to access resources that help you prevent pregnancies if you don't want them? What can we do systematically in the environment? So in that, Erica, I think we would, if we keep pushing that kind of framework of reproductive justice, looking at the structure, looking at the environment around people that really influence whether or not they can achieve reproductive justice, which is the right to bear children, the right not to bear children, and the right to raise children in healthy and safe environments, then I think the question of irresponsibility becomes moot. The responsibility would be in the government and the state and communities to make sure that we are creating an environment for reproductive justice to happen. So who's irresponsible? Employers who don't make sure that everybody has access to health care, the companies that dump pollutants in areas where poor and low-income people live, that we would start to kind of take the irresponsibility off the woman's body and put it on places where we could actually make some kind of structural and environmental changes. So I think that's one way, but that is going to take activism, and that is going to take a constant push away from an individual woman's responsibility or irresponsibility to where is that woman, what's the environment around that woman. If you really don't want women to have to make the very always conflicted and heavy and difficult choice of abortion, then what could you do structurally and systematically in the environment to make sure that she never has to experience unwanted pregnancy? So I think that's one way. And again, that would help with the stigma around young parenthood too, because reproductive justice claims that you have the right to reproduce, you have the right to have a child, no matter your income, incarceration status, immigrant status, age. And so if we keep pushing that vision, like just that is not in our realm, it's a basic human right to reproduce when you want, then the stigma on teen pregnancy becomes injustice, that you are affecting or encroaching upon a human right to have a child. And so stop it. Stop stigmatizing that. There are other arguments about how to deal with the stigma around irresponsibility of a woman and this kind of dual standard that it's, an irresponsible woman that's to blame. People say, well, let's bring men into the picture. And I do think, part of the viability of the stigma against a woman who chooses abortion or decides to have an abortion, or a woman who carries a pregnancy to term and raises a child while young, is that we're not thinking about the man at all, right? Like a considerable number of the women who have teen pregnancies are with partners that are not teens, right? They're older. But we still label them teen pregnancies and stigmatize it and approach it like the CDC and a variety of institutions approach it as a social problem that we got to get to teenagers to solve. Mm-hmm. That only works because we're not thinking about who are the partners. Is this really just a teen problem? We're assuming it's always consensual sex, like all these things. So we could bring the men into the picture. The problem with that is then we continue to stigmatize and stereotype the individual, bringing men in, and they did, and for a period in the 90s, they brought attention to men, mm-hmm. but wouldn't you know it, it ended up being kind of men as predators, and that we should penalize men who impregnate a teenager, and whenever something is criminalized, where do the people usually get prosecuted the most, or who are the people who usually get prosecuted the most? Men of color, right? And men low income, don't have resources, are more under public scrutiny because they have to use public funding systems and things like that. So it's problematic because there again, we're focusing, even though white older men fathered teen pregnancies too, the vulnerablest men are going to be suspect to that criminalization. And again, it's just sticking on the individuals. Either men are responsible or irresponsible. And while I am all for calling out men way more than we do, and approaching sexuality is something that all partners are equally responsible for the consequences for, all for that. In terms of stigma and challenging the stigma, I don't know that would take away that whole like woman is irresponsible, because then woman becomes victim and passive and has no capacity for sexual desire herself, and I don't know. So I really am a fan. It's complex, and I'm really a fan of reproductive justice for paying attention to structural, community-based, environmental-based change.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So sticking to that theme of government maybe is responsible for this type of stigmatization, what would you say to lawmakers that are trying to direct or trying to prevent women from having abortions or
being able to access abortion,
for being able
or
to access
legally
that.
do it?
Yeah.
I would say don't.
Don't.
I would hope that, Roe v. Wade is still in effect. We still have a constitutional right to terminate pregnancies if we don't want them or aren't prepared for them. And I would say that should remain a fundamental right. Again, it's in line with reproductive justice. We should have the right to have children or not have children. And if we were to limit our ability to, elect to abort a fetus, then we're limiting, that's reproductive injustice. We would have to have children, and we shouldn't be forced to, first of all, we shouldn't be forced to have any medical procedure or a medical outcome that we don't want. And so that it just encroaches on too many rights. So I would say, no, don't do it.
Don't do it.
Just don't do it.
Awesome.
Just because I think it's something that I've said to you earlier, which is I think we live in a time right now, well, I don't think that we've ever not actually, where abortion politics are very important, that many are afraid of the changing composition of the Supreme Court and the potential for states to further limit a woman's ability to access an abortion. Also, clinics are closing. It's harder, regionally to get to one, that kind of thing. I just caution in kind of moving to ensure that women still are able to have the right not to have children, that we don't rely on the stigma of teen pregnancy and motherhood, that we don't rely on the narrative of if we don't have this constitutional right, teenagers will have to have babies and tragedy will ensue, because this is part of what fuels the stigma of teen motherhood, is that idea that if you have a baby before some sort of sanctioned moment in your life, it will always be doom and gloom, horror, a burden for you, your child, the nation. And researchers have consistently brought attention to the fact that this is not true. What matters the most is the kinds of access to resources you have, which unfortunately, because of the way our society is stratified, is just and usually inherited. Like it depends on the family you were born in, whether or not you're going to have a more likelihood to have positive outcomes or negative outcomes. It really, we cannot continue to perpetuate this narrative that teenage pregnancy and motherhood is always and only a problem, because it's just going to obstruct what I think people who want women to have access to abortions want, which is women to be able to make the sexual and reproductive decisions that make sense for them without fear of social shame, stigma, structural repercussions like losing your job or those kinds of things. So I would just add that, because I don't know that I said that, and I think it does play a role in the stigmatization of young motherhood.
And that's how they are affected.
Yeah.
And dehumanized as women.
Right, so like the idea is that we're helping women by using this narrative to ensure that we still have access to abortion, but really that narrative has functioned, as I show in the book, to make young parents' lives really difficult.
Well, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so
Pleasure.
much for taking your time and talking to me.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
All
Your
right.
wise words were awesome, and hopefully everyone can really hear you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.